Hey, what's going on, peeps? Welcome back to the channel, and we are going to continue to do our study on the Summary of Christian Doctrine by Louis Berkhoff. And as usual, got my coffee. This one has got an extra shot of espresso on it because I'm already starting to get a headache because I drank my coffee a little too late. So yes, I do have a caffeine addiction, which is not good. So today's topic is going to be on, of course, religion. We're still studying the first lessons of the introduction of the Louis Berkhoff doctrines. And we're still on the topic of religion. And today I want to talk about how, we talked about the fact about, we asked the question, can man approach God? Or what would happen if man approached God? And we said that if man approached God on their own, without a mediator, Jesus Christ, namely, then we would be swallowed up because of the fact that we are sinful and God is holy. And so we mentioned that we need Christ to be able to approach God. And what I want to ask today is the question of, like, in what manner, the question I have is what manner, or basically the title is the manner in which we approach God. Like, so let's say that I say, yeah, I want to approach God through Christ, right? How must I now then worship him? Or what must I do? Or what are the rules and the guidelines that define how we worship, or what we do that defines worship? So that's what I'm trying to kind of get into briefly. What are the guidelines? And so I'm going to go ahead and read just a very small excerpt of the book and just dive right into it. Let me read it. It says this. It says, in light of Scripture, we learn to understand that religion is a relation in which man stands to God, a relation in which man is conscious of the absolute majesty and infinite power of God, and of his own utter insignificance and absolute helplessness. That is a powerful statement. It is extremely powerful. Think of this. He's saying that in religion, it's a relationship in which we stand in relation to God. And watch this. It is a relation in which man is conscious, and here's the key. Man is conscious at this point in his life of the absolute majesty and infinite power of God. So the first thing that he sees is who God is, right? He is infinite in his majesty. He is wonderful in his glory, and he is just an amazing being, right? And that's the first thing that mankind is able to apprehend about who God is his infinite majesty. The what we would call the awesomeness of God, or that sense of God that strikes awe in the hearts of men, and properly so, because he is God, right? And so that's not only the first thing that we see. The second thing that we see is what happens to us. We begin to see how he describes it, our own utter insignificance and absolute helplessness. And I like that because it's almost like this idea that, like, we understand that we are dependent upon water, and we are dependent upon food and all of these other elements and things that keep us alive, but we're not in awe of bread. We are not in awe of water, if you will, until we're in the desert, right, and we're dying, and somebody comes and brings us a glass of water at the right time when we're about to die, and then we swallow that thing up. But I think that even that analogy falls short when we look at who God is and who we are, and that absolute helplessness that we feel before his presence, because he, like I said, he even though he is made, or we are made in his image, there's a sense in which we are not like him. There's a real sense in which, like, he transcends everything that is here in this created sphere. Everything in this created sphere is contingent, dependent, and derived, and it exists, if you will, totally out of the power of God. And God is the only one who stands outside of that, who is not a contingent, a dependent being, but rather he's the one who has life in and of himself and is self-sufficient. So that's the first thing that we see is religion is a relation in which man stands to God, we see who God is in His majesty, and we also see our own utter insignificance and our total dependency upon Him. So let me just read one more line. And then it says, religion may be defined as a conscious and voluntary relationship to God, which expresses itself in grateful worship and loving service. And this is what I wanted to harp on as far as the question of the manner in which we approach God. It says this: the manner of this religious worship and service is not left to the arbitrary will of man, but it is determined by God. And that's what I wanted to focus on, because I think several years ago I had an opportunity to preach a sermon at a sister church, and what I ended up doing was I went into the kids' room, and I didn't have this planned, but I went into the kids' room, and I don't know if what I was doing. Like I think I was sitting or something for the first few minutes right before I preached the sermon. But all I know is that I found a Mr. Potato Head, like one of those old school Mr. Potato Heads on the corner there. And so something came to my mind, and I grabbed it, and I'm like, wow, this is such a perfect analogy with my sermon, because I wanted to explain to people in that sermon how it is that humanity, like how we see God a lot of times. And so here's the way it works. I've heard people say to me over and over, for example, my God is a God of love. Or they would say something like, oh no, my God is not a God of wrath, He's a God of love. Or my God is a loving God, or whatever. And what they're trying to convey is, what they're doing is that they're picking and choosing what they want God to be. And so that's why in that sermon, I had put that Mr. Potato on top of the pulpit, and what I did was I used it as an illustration, because if you know Mr. Potato Head, right, you understand that what makes him awesome is that you can kind of switch him around and change his head and change his beard or whatever, and his mustache or whatnot, and you can change him around and make him look the way you want him to look. And so you can make them with different shoes or whatever, different body parts. And so that was what was fun about Mr. Potato Head, is that you can get creative with him and build him however you want to build him. Well, I feel like that's exactly what we do with God. It's like this person would say, well, my way is this way, or I think that God ought to be worshipped in this way, or for me to worship God is this way. And so it tends to be this idea where it's all up for grabs, okay? God is letting everybody decide how people want to worship Him, and that's not the case at all. And so what we want to show is that God has determined that not only that He has not only created humanity for Himself, but He has also endowed humanity, right, with the sense of, like we said before, the image of God. But at the same time, He has shown us exactly the way in which we should be approaching Him. The first and foremost is, with what we talked about last video, is that we should first and foremost approach Him only through the mediation of Jesus Christ. Because the Bible does tell us that no one will come to the Father except through Jesus Christ. No one comes to the Father except through Jesus. And so whether or not you're a Buddhist, or whether or not you're a Muslim, or whatever religion you think you are, and you are not coming to God the Father, the creator of the universe, through Jesus Christ, for as bigoted as that might sound, and for as what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word, when you narrow everything down to just one option, it might come to my mind. But like, the idea is that how can you be so, like, is it naive? No, not naive. I gotta get this word. Narrow-minded. There you go. And so this idea is that how can you be so narrow-minded to say that there's only one way to God? Well, listen, we didn't make that up. This is a construct not of the human mind, but of the actual scriptures themselves. This is a revelation from God, who has revealed to us how we should come to God. And God has not only provided a way, which is an awesome thing because He doesn't have to provide any way, but He has actually provided a way for us to be saved. And so this is why we say it is only through the mediation of Christ. It is only through Jesus Christ that we are able to approach him to begin with. And then secondly, once we do that, and now we are in a right position with God because we have been justified through Jesus and what he has done for us, then now the question is, okay, well, now how do I worship? And so God has revealed these things to us in the scriptures, how he wants us to worship him, and he has laid down the ground rules, and even with what we call ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, where in there's several sacraments like Lord's Supper and the baptism and all that, in which these are things that we do to properly worship God, because God has set these guidelines as to how he wants to be worshipped. And again, chiefly, it is through his son, Jesus Christ. Now, here's what I want to point out to. Let me just backtrack just a little bit to go back to the whole Mr. Potato Head thing. I realize that it's kind of hard to be objective with the whole God thing, right? It's very hard in this day and age because we are living in a day and age where everything is relative, right? People want to say, oh, well, that's just your truth, or well, not for me. For me, it's A, B, and C, And so there's this idea that truth is no longer objective, okay? The only objective truth for people is that there is no objective truth. And it's kind of a contradictory worldview, but that's what's winning the day now. You can't even make concrete statements to people. You can't make concrete statements to people without them getting super offended. And people are so sensitive. I don't mean to sound rude, and I want to be as loving as I possibly can, but people are people are a bunch of babies nowadays. Everybody has a certain worldview that is like they're so offensive or defensive about stuff, and it's like, oh, they hurt my feelings, and it's like, listen, truth does not care about feelings. It just doesn't. And if I tell somebody, for example, that God is a God of wrath, that he is a God of justice and a God of holiness and pure, and someone gets offended by that, I'm sorry that it offended you, but I don't make up the truth. No more than if someone is offended by the fact that 1 plus 1 equals 2. If someone gets mad at that, well, I can't do anything about that. You know what I'm saying? Truth is true no matter what. And all that to say that, God is who he is apart from what we would want him to be. And so this idea that God has commanded us how we should worship him, or actually, let me take that back. God has commanded us how we should first and foremost approach him, which again, through Jesus. But not only that, but he has also given us the rule by which we could worship him after that. And let me read a passage in Micah that touches up on what I'm trying to say right now. And it's found in Micah chapter 6. This is a well-beloved Christian verse, and I've seen people with tattoos on their bodies with this verse. Watch this. It's found in Micah in the Old Testament, chapter 6, verse 6. And it starts this way. With what shall I come before the Lord? What's the question? With what shall I come before the Lord? So already with that question, you already have 1,000 answers in less than 500 people. Because if you ask them, let me ask you a question, like how shall you come before the Lord? Oh, well, for me, it's A, B, and C. And for me, well, I don't even have a Lord because I don't even believe in God. And so everybody's got their own opinions. But from Micah's perspective, this is what he says. With what shall I come before the Lord? And if I'm going to bring something to God, what do I bring to him? What are the rules? And then it says, shall I come before him with burnt offerings? With calves a year old? In other words, do I bring animals to sacrifice? Do I bring something that is sacrificial to me, that I have to give it to God? And then it says in verse 7, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? And there's this idea where this sounds kind of primitive, and it is primitive because we don't offer anybody calves or rams or oil. But keep in mind that back in those days, these things were of high value. And so oil and even offerings that were dedicated to God was extreme. It had value to it. And so the author is saying, with what shall I come before God? What will please God? That's the question. What will please God? And then watch this. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression? Think about that. And again, if you know any of the Old Testament history, the firstborn, right, was the one who was elevated to a higher status because he was the one who would get the higher inheritance and so on. And so for the firstborn, for the father and the family, the firstborn was of high importance and high value. And so he's asking the question, should I even give my firstborn for my transgressions? Like, what will please God? How do I come to God? And then he says, shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And then in verse 8, which is so beautiful, he says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? Now, there's the question. God has told you, O man, and a lot of times in the Old Testament, I don't want to push this too far, but a lot of time when you see the word, O man, it's not necessarily a polite way to speak from the biblical perspective. Oh man is usually almost a not a slanderous word, but whenever you see that oh man, almost always is going to come an indictment that follows it, or a sense of like almost like if today we would say something like, dude, don't you get it, or how can you be so stupid, or whatever. Like, it's almost something like that. But when you see the word oh man in the scriptures, usually it is followed up by something that is almost like a rebuke or a reproof. So he has told you, oh man, what is good. Watch this. And what does the Lord require of you? Not what does the Lord, watch this. It's not what does the Lord hopes from you, or what the Lord suggests from you, but rather what does the Lord require of you? This is a requirement. And he says this, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And if you just saw those three right there, God has told us that he wants us to do justice, which is because it reflects his character. He wants us to do justice. That's how we worship God. In one sense, we worship God by showing justice in the earth, by being fair, by being righteous and just to one another, right? And also to love kindness. And so, like, there's a sense in which this is almost to say, not entirely, that this is functioning almost in a horizontal plane, right? From man to man. Love righteousness and be kind to one another. That's what God is requiring. And then the second thing, which is the most important thing, even from the lips of Jesus, the two commandments that he says is love your neighbor and love the Lord the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which is the greatest commandment. And then it says not only to do justice and kindness, but here it is, to walk humbly with your God. To walk humbly with God. And to pay just a little attention to the word humbly. To be humbled before God is this idea that you are bringing nothing to the table, that you are a sinner, that we are wretched, that we are in need, and that we are that we are beggars, and that God is the one who has his hand open, ready to give, and we are the ones who are just grabbing and receiving because we are understanding of our desperation and our need for him. And so that's what God requires of us. So he has commanded us how we should worship, how we should approach him, and the things that God is requiring of us. Now, lastly, let me say this to wrap the video up. We do not get to tell God what he ought to do with his creation. And this is huge in our day and age. Is that if we have a daughter, for example, that we absolutely love, and something happens to her, that God forbid, right? Something happens to her and she gets into a car accident and she dies and perishes, and then now all of a sudden we wanna throw our hands up at God and even not only question him but blame him and begin to tell him how he ought to run the universe, when the universe in one sense is only messed up because we are the ones who messed it up. It's not that God did it, it's that we did it. Okay, so there's a sense in which, like, it's actually astounding, right? That we never praise God for the good things that he gives to us. But the minute the minute things happen to us, we start blaming him for things. And so we begin to tell God how he ought to run the universe, right? Well, if I was God, I would do A, B, and C. If I was God, I would keep my daughter alive. And why would God do this and do that? And so that, in reality, that is extremely offensive to God. I believe that God can handle those questions. I believe that God sometimes may invite them, as with what happened with Job, but to always keep in mind who you're speaking with when you're making your complaints to God, because God is in the heavens and we are down here below, and He is our maker and He is God, and you are a creature, and you have no right and no business to question your maker as to whatsoever He pleases to do with a sinful person like us. And so this is why we stay humbly walking with God and hope and pray that He does not enter into judgment with us. And so this is why we again say we need Christ, because if He does enter into judgment with us and we don't have Christ, then we will fail. We will perish. And so I hope that this is a nugget of truth for you guys. I'm realizing that my videos are now past 8 minutes. Now they're 15 and now they're 20. But I'm going to try to keep them that low, 20. And I'm going to end this video for now. We're going to continue with the book. And we'll go from there. I'm loving doing this thing with you guys. And if you have any friends that need to hear this, just send them the link and have them subscribe. You guys subscribe. And let's keep doing this together, because like I said, I'm a dying man, and there are dying men out there who need to hear this. God bless you guys.